still standing and able to come and speak for, I hope for them and for all of us who were here. I want to thank Lord George Robertson, former NATO Secretary General, for being here. He was there. Ambassador Sabat, thank you very much. And Mr. Pavlicek and others involved in sponsoring this, I thank you. And mostly, President Pavel, I want to thank you for many things, but I would like to begin at least at part of the end of this story. When I became president, I wanted to expand NATO, but I knew that even some of the NATO members were questioning it. They were very proud of the military alliance and what it had done to stabilize Europe at the end of the war. And they were uncertain of whether the expansion would be more politics than security. What did it mean? Where would we stop? You know, all the things that keep people from doing things they should do in many areas of life. And Václav Havel was a remarkable man who had a good sense of humor and was not particularly overbearing. And Mr. President, I say this with great admiration. No one would ever make the mistake of thinking that he had been the head of his country's armed forces before he became president. He was a poet, a playwright, with an amazing imagination. But he was adamant about one thing from the first time I met him until I went with Madeline to your beautiful cathedral to his funeral. And that was that the Czech Republic would never be totally secure unless it was in a network of European security anchored by NATO. And I watched him make arguments for years before we finally worked all this out. But I remember 25 years ago, and I remember earlier than that when we voted to expand. We were 25 years ago, 27 years ago, I think we were in Madrid voting to do this. And it's funny what you remember, since men often don't wear ties anymore, but I'm glad that all of you still do. I still remember that we were in Madrid and that perhaps their most famous manufacturer of ties, Loa, made a tie for all the people who had come to the NATO summit to vote to expand NATO. And on the tie, there was a depiction of a very famous Spanish game, which at the time, which involved throwing real live human beings up and down out of a blanket. And we could see all these, and you know, so you might have an orange or a blue or a whatever figure, but they were all, I still got that tie. I looked at it again before I came on this trip. And sometimes you just have to take a chance. And that's what everybody involved 25 years ago decided to do. I think that it's been a good investment. It was a good, sensible risk, and it has immensely strengthened NATO. And the motto of this conference is as true today as it was then, perhaps more true. You can't ever take your security for granted. And we know that we need more networks of cooperation. For the benefit of those who are not Czech, who are here, and anybody who may be covering this, I do think, we have a few people in America, I'm embarrassed to say, who like to appear as if somehow they think NATO is a con game and the United States is giving too much and nobody else is giving enough. It's ludicrous, that position. This is something that is helping us all, and no one today has been more visible. But I want this, since we're here and the Czech government is hosting us, what have you done with your 25 years? Prime Minister Fiala was among the first Western leaders to visit Ukraine after the invasion of 2022. And you, Mr. President, last year became the first to visit the Eastern Front. Over the last 2 years, this country of only 11 million people has delivered more than $2.3 billion worth of military assistance to Ukraine. You were the first NATO member to give the Ukrainians heavy armored vehicles. And now you're leading the drive. I love this. I'm going to have a field day with this when I get home to America, and I'm lobbying the Congress to do our part. You are trying to figure out how to get 1 million artillery shells to Ukraine in a global collection effort that goes far beyond NATO members. Nobody else is doing that I'm aware of. So the most important thing I can say is thank you. Furthermore, I live in a country with 340 million people, and we have trouble managing our immigration problems on the southern border, as all of you know. 1.9 million people had to be processed last year. The Czech Republic has 11 million people. You do the math. And it's taken more than 500,000 refugees from Ukraine to try to show solidarity with freedom and decency and democracy. This NATO deal has been the best thing that ever happened to all the rest of us because of what the Czech Republic and Poland, and sometimes more reluctantly, but eventually there, and Hungary have done with it. We did the right thing to expand NATO and to keep expanding it. And now there are more than 30 countries in NATO. So this is a day to celebrate our forebears, say they did a good job. It is also perhaps a day to think about a little bit what lies ahead. But I do think all of you should be grateful, because I'm not sure we could have done this then if it had not been for Havel's leadership. Just because he was so dogged about it. When I was president, we had a few members of Congress who wanted the White House to do things. And they were impossible to live with until you finally did whatever it was they wanted. And so we set up in the White House what we called a Just Say Yes list. Somebody got on that list, you didn't waste any time. Whatever they wanted, you just went ahead and said yes, because you knew you were going to do it anyway, and you didn't want to be an old person by the time you finally got around to being able to do something else. That's the way Havel was about this. It was great. So we should celebrate that. But I think we also should support those who have made sure in these last 25 years that the expansion was handled in the proper way. Not too fast, not too slow, making sure people were ready to assume the military responsibilities. Your president knows a lot about that. It's one thing to talk about doing something, quite another to be able to do it, and to do it in the right way. And I'm very grateful again to you. And finally, I think we can celebrate the fact that Finland and Sweden have just become the 31st and 32nd members of NATO. And they are very capable of strengthening our military capacity, our defense capacity. And they make the strategic geography of Northern Europe look entirely different. So for all of you who supported that, I thank you. I just wanted to say one or two other things, because I know you have a lot of things to do on your conference. When we were doing all this, I was really lucky that Madeleine Albright was my UN ambassador, and that I appointed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General John Shalikashvili, who was born in Poland to a father from Georgia and a Polish mother, and was the first enlisted person ever to rise all the way through the ranks to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was really good for America's knowledge of geography, too. They had to learn how to say Shalikashvili and then realize where Georgia was, that it was not a place that grew peaches in the middle of America. It was a remarkable place fighting for its own freedom. And we had, as my Deputy Secretary of State, to Madeleine Strobe Talbot, who is also still with us today, who when we were boys, when we were just 22 and living together in England, he had run the Moscow Bureau of Time magazine and was selected by the representatives of Nikita Khrushchev to receive his memoirs and translate and edit them. So the other thing I was doing when I first found the Czech Republic, I was living in England, and I would get up every morning and make breakfast for my roommate, Strobe Talbot, and listen to Nikita Khrushchev's voice over the tape recorder. And anybody who was thinking about anything then would have wondered, will the Berlin Wall ever fall? Will the Warsaw Pact ever come to an end? Will freedom ever return? But there were a lot of people who were convinced that it would. And the interesting thing is how many people were ready to make the most of it when it did. Because that's really what we're celebrating here, isn't it? I mean, 25 years ago, you had to figure out what was the next big building block and what would happen after the Berlin Wall fell. And you did the right thing. And it's funny, sometimes I feel like I was just the guy who was along for the ride. I was lucky. I was in the right place at the right time more than once. But I remember 25 years ago as if it were yesterday. And I believed that if we did this right, it would be peace and prosperity for 25 years. And I believed that if Russia made a decision that I was always afraid they would, which is not to keep working together with us, but to try to reestablish in some way a dominant geographical position on the European continent, that whether we did NATO right then would determine what would happen when the crisis came. And I think we should all say, all of you today, you should think about how you feel about all this. And think about the next 25 years. I think President Putin made a mistake deciding to stay for life. I love being America's president. I would have stayed forever if there were no term limits, or until the people defeated me at the polls. But it's better in a free society to extol the system, the values, the rule of law, instead of the dominance of any individual. We should all do our part, give it our best, and go on with our lives as best we can, grateful for the chance to serve. But I just ask you to think about all this now, because he probably won't like my saying this, but President Putin's not going to live forever any more than I am. The last I checked, that we all have an expiration date. We just don't necessarily know when it is. And our job is to leave our children and grandchildren a future better than we had. So I will say this: I do not regret a single minute I spent trying to bring Russia into partnership with the rest of us. And we all know I failed, don't we? But I don't regret it. I met with President Yeltsin 13 times. I met with President Putin when he was prime minister, and then president 5 times. We had a NATO-Russia Founding Act to have a partnership. We gave Russia a vote in NATO affairs early. We offered them the chance to participate, and how we managed the end of both the Bosnian campaign and the campaign in Kosovo. I don't regret any of it. And I failed. Or we did, in the sense that Russia took a different path. But it's important to get caught trying to do the right thing. So there will come another time in the next 25 years, I predict. Maybe I'll be long gone, but we'll have a chance to write a new history. And it'll be better because of the strength of the Czech Republic. It'll be better because you let Sweden and Finland into NATO. It'll be better because no one can claim you're operating from a position of weakness when you hold open the door of partnership. I will always regret that all those years, in the years that I was president, 8 years, I met with the leader of Russia only 3 times less than all Americans had between 1945 and 1992, just in those 8 years. So when I hear all this stuff about how we jam them with the expansion of NATO, that's a big fairy tale. But the people of this country and your neighbors in Poland and Hungary and everywhere else, they deserve the right to be free. We deserve the chance to see Europe democratic and united and at peace for the first time since nation states rose up on the European continent. And as my old friends used to say, it was not NATO moving east. It was the East knocking on NATO's door. So I ask you in this security conference, without obviously ignoring what the consequences are now, we have to stay with Ukraine as long as Ukraine is fighting. Every one of us do. And the people who act like it doesn't matter to America or any other country just need to go back and review the history of Europe from the 1930s to the current day and see if we don't have a common responsibility to our people and to the future. But you also should be thinking of a brighter day. Yes, we need to get everybody behind the Ukraine. I admire the way President Zelensky and his family and his administration have hung in there. But someday we will have other options. And we need conferences like this to think about, what do we want NATO and Europe to look like 25 years from now? What about 50 years from now? I think that my President Biden, and our country, our government has the right position on this. I hope we will be able to persuade the Congress to go along. I think we need to make sure people know more about how much stronger NATO is with Sweden and Finland in it, and what a complementary picture it makes. But the most important thing I want you to do is not be ashamed or embarrassed, even in the midst of this conflict in Ukraine, to imagine 25 years from now. It will help us to hold support for staying the course in Ukraine if people actually believe that it can be different than it is. I do. I'm sorry that when I was there, I couldn't persuade Mr. Putin to stay with where I think we were going with his predecessor. I did my best. But time and circumstance happens to everybody. You're gonna have another chance. So we gotta stay together, stay with Ukraine, get through it, make sure the world knows how much better NATO is now because of your new members and what's being done, and keep dreaming of a better tomorrow. Remember, Havel was a poet and a playwright, and he had an infectious sense of humor, which he kept even when he was in prison. And he is the only head of state that I ever had ask me when I was invited him to the White House for a state dinner. He said, I want you to get Lou Reed to perform at the state dinner. He's the only head of state who ever asked me for someone who was a rock and roll legend, but everybody else wanted to hear a famous cellist, a famous violinist, see a great actor. Havel knew, as we say where I grew up, where the rubber met the road. Don't forget, NATO lives where the rubber meets the road. So be proud of what you've done, prove that it works, and start dreaming right now about what you hope will happen when this meeting is held 25 years from today. Thank you.
Mr. President, thank you so much, and for so much more than just this inspiring speech. Dámy a pánové, vážení diváci, vážení...
Ladies and gentlemen, now I have the pleasure of welcoming you to a very unique panel, unique in the Czech Republic, because the goal of the next panel is clear. If you want to find a consensus on top security issues that are ahead of all of us, then it's already a tradition of this conference that we have a political debate